multiple, and I agree with everyone. I want to know what distinguishes you to be able to actually get your point across in legislation changed. And I've been looking at past history trying to determine who would be the most effective in getting the things that I agree with, and I agree with most everybody. And that's what I was wondering, what distinguishes you to be able to go ahead and get your ideas into legislation?
Thank you. Gina, do you want to just get started?
So in terms of policy and legislation, I think the one thing that really distinguishes me is that I have pledged to vote against our Senate leadership, Senator Ruggiero, who for decades, he's been in office since 1984, and for decades he has shown that he is anti-choice. He's shown that he's anti-climate legislation by taking fossil fuel money and anti-gun safety by taking NRA money. And with my commitment to vote against him, it means that it is my commitment to vote for this progressive policy and to get it passed, because he blocks all that type of legislation. And if we keep those types of politicians and that type of leadership in office, then we're not going to pass the progressive legislation that we need to pass. And I mean, other differences as well. Sure.
Yep. Thank you, Elaine, for your question. Good to see you in person. So I have been working up at the State House, as I mentioned, for the past several years, working in lots of coalitions to advance a lot of progressive legislation. So I was lucky to succeed Rebecca as president of Rhode Island Now. One of our biggest victories was in 2019 when we codified Roe versus Wade and the Reproductive Privacy Act. Yes, please clap it up, because look at what's been happening in Texas and other places, and so many people, including Senate President Ruggiero, said, don't worry, that will never happen. There's no urgency. We don't have to worry about it. But we knew that there was, with the person who we won't name in the White House, and the changes in the judiciary. So that was a big fight, and I learned so much by being part of the steering committee to pass that legislation. So Rhode Island Now was one of 6 organizations that we were driving that work, and we learned about showing up every day, about, you know, working with many other organizations and legislators, and how then we could apply that to other things. So we signed that bill. I felt very fortunate to get to stand behind then Governor Raimondo the night she signed the legislation when it passed both chambers. The next year, I'll just give you a quick sense, because I've worked on lots of coalitions, but in 2020 we formed the Campaign for Gun Violence Prevention. And we've been able to pass a lot of pieces of common sense gun legislation, taking many of those lessons about how to get organized and advocate at the State House. And so we still have things to pass. We have to pass the high capacity magazine ban and the assault weapons ban, but these are urgent issues. And so from that work, I know how to work with not only other legislators in both the Senate and the House, but with the advocacy community to make sure they know when committee meetings are, when those hearings are, when to show up. And so together, I know that we can pass important pieces of legislation that are going to make a real difference for so many people in Rhode Island. So I have that substantive knowledge, and then I can build on existing organized relationships as well.
Thank you, Hillary. Jessica, do you want to share a few words?
Yeah, I will try, although, you know, I have no like direct line to Brett Jacobs' mind, so if I, you know, say anything you don't like, it's a Jessica issue, not a Brett issue. But what I really like about Brett is the policy experience combined with the lived experience that makes him 100% committed and maybe even more knowledgeable, you know, through life about the issues that we care about: affordable housing, public school, criminal justice reform. And so the commitment is 100% on all of the progressive issues, and his experience includes collaborating with a diverse set of stakeholders and being able to talk with them and listen to them successfully and bring them together. And I've seen that firsthand in the 6 years that I've known Brett, and was impressed by it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sam?
I've had the experience of working in a couple of organizations, the school board and the city council, where people kind of looked at me and said, what are you doing here? You don't have anything in common with these people. How do you expect to get anything done? And I have found that I've been able to be effective by developing personal relationships with people and getting to know them, and they're getting to know me, and then finding ways that we can work together. Now, those two bodies are largely driven by interests rather than by ideology. And when you have competing interests, it's often more possible to find a compromise of some kind, whereby each side's interest will be addressed to some extent. Another thing I found, which has allowed me to work with people, is my reluctance to take credit for things. I find that if I go up to people and say, let's work on this project, I'll do all the work, you can get all the credit, that seems to work pretty well for me. And so I found that I can get into a setting, find an issue that's important. I mentioned the zero tolerance policy in the school board. I really didn't have an idea about that until I got there. The Florida license plate issue, I found out that while I was campaigning and speaking with folks. And then find a creative way to get people to work together on it. Now, there are some issues where there's an ideological clash, and this will not work in that setting. But for the issues that motivated me to get up there, the public schools, the city's finances, the use of the American Rescue Plan Act funds, there's $1 billion that needs to be distributed. I do think there's room for collegiality, compromise, and building personal relationships that will allow me to be effective in serving our district.
Thank you. Alex?
I like what Sam said. So the ideological and the interests, right? And I think a lot of times what happens in government and in state government particularly is that we can all get around an issue and say, yes, it ought to be this way. We need to improve this, right? But how do we do that? And then we choose on ideological lines. Well, that means we have to do this, and we're going to pass this law. And just because you legislate something, just because you decree it, doesn't make it so, right? So it's like the daycare example I mentioned earlier, right? I come to things with sound economic reasoning and look at it and say, what are the incentives? If you do X, what's going to happen over here? Are you going to achieve your objective? I may not agree with what you think ought to happen, but a lot of times I could say, if you wanted to actually achieve that, this is what you should do. And when you try and reconcile that with ideology, it often doesn't, it's not compatible. So you'll say, I want things to be this way, and this is how I think I can affect that change. And then you do that action, and you don't get the expected outcome. And that serves nobody's benefit, right? Because you lose, and then also kind of mucks things up for the opposing side. So I think having a genuine discourse with people on trying to solve real problems and say, how do we actually affect this change that we seek? And where do we compromise on the things that say, hey, you know, this is a common sense idea. How would we actually get that to flow through the system so that we can incentivize people to do these things that align to community interests, right? So it's more about, you know, buckling down and getting away from the philosophy about, you know, free rides and free, you know what I mean? Like getting away from the abstract ideas of government and down to the nitty gritty of, if you want to actually achieve this thing, what would you need to do to incentivize the behavior and to have people that are at least thinking through the impacts of what the decisions, you know, what outcomes are going to have. So I'd say that's where my benefit would be, is in doing that thinking and fleshing out the numbers. So.
Thank you. Ray?
So I went to the General Assembly. I had 13 things I wished to do, and I achieved 12 of them. Later, the budget came. Rodney Driver and I sat there, and they presented it to us at 1 o'clock and told us they hoped to vote by 2. The budget. Rodney Driver and I stood on the House floor and said we would not vote, and worse than that, we're going to take them to court. Okay? Maddie Smith, the Speaker, took us into the back room. I'm being disingenuous. Into the House lounge and threatened our lives. And then held the budget overnight for the first time in history. And Common Cause and AFL-CIO and everybody else was at my door. Can we have a copy? No one had ever had the budget before. We did that. 14 reforms. No smoking on the floor. Okay? Doesn't sound like big stuff, but Skeffington smoked on the floor. I've done it. I've been there. I know how. I'll do it again. Not on a lot of issues, on a fewer issues. And I know how. And let me tell you this final thing, which is important. And Sam kind of told you, but I like to put it this way. You ready? In the House, there were 100 of us. 10 of them had all the power and all the clout because most of the rest of the 90 gave it to them. They were in charge. 10 of us, Linda Kushner, we were there for policy. So 10 power, 10 policy, and 80 for the license plate, I think. I'm not sure what they were there for. But you learn about each member, what they want, how to go get the 17 Republicans. We had 17, they got 5 or 6 now. And you can do it. I was told to say this. This distinguishes me from all the rest. I know how. I served, I know you don't want to hear it, I served with the President of the Senate in the House. I've been to his house to dinner 4 or 5 times. Do I like his policies and his politics? No. Can I sit and talk to him? Yes. And I've already talked to him about education and property. I'm going to achieve if you send me.